My wife and I are part of a community group at the church we're members at. We started in the group about a year and a half ago. It's a group comprised of mostly younger married couples in their 20s and 30s. None of us had kids, but just in the last couple months, two of the couples have had kids, and another one's pregnant, so we're that season of life. But we're also in the season where in the last few months, two couples have left the group, and in the next couple months, two more couples will be leaving the group, all for like school and jobs outside of our city. So at its largest, our group was about 8 couples, and in a couple months, it'll be down to just 4 couples. And so in light of the upcoming season of transition, one of our group leaders suggested we have a time of reflecting on the past year or so as a community group, thinking about what's gone well, what could be improved on, done differently, the things we've liked, haven't liked. The structure of our community group generally looks like this. We show up at 7, chit chat till about 7:30. Around 7:30, we jump into sharing our highs and lows from the past week. It can kind of sound cliche, maybe it is, but it's also a really great tool for hearing about what is going on in each other's lives in a succinct way, and both getting some of the good and some of the bad, or hard and celebratory. And then after that, we jump into working through some questions that are sent out by the community group leader based on the sermon from the previous Sunday. And then we'll wrap up with some prayer. Maybe we'll throw in listening to a worship song and singing along together at some point. But overall, a great and probably typical, maybe, structure of a community group. And so we wanted to kind of reflect on those components and see, then in light of that reflection, what direction do we want to head as a small group of 4 couples, and how do we want to structure things going forward. The conversation kicks off, and it's open forum. We're sitting in the living room, and folks share, and there's a little bit of a theme that starts to build as folks are sharing, which sounds a little bit like this. Folks saying, I've really valued the community. Some folks said, I've never been a part of a community like this. It's really helped me to grow spiritually. Some of the favorite aspects of the group are like when we get to pray together, when we do some worship songs together, or when we just hang out as a community group. And there's a trend that some of us didn't love the questions that we get and talk through each week. And maybe it's not the questions that we didn't love, but it can feel like when we get to that portion of our evening, we're sort of just trying to get through the questions, all of the questions, or some of the questions, and almost check out from really engaging in one another's spiritual formation and journey. And there's really no crosstalk. It's a question asked, and then people answer their response to the question. And folks have felt that as great as those questions are, and that maybe there's nothing wrong with question and response, it's led to sort of a drier time in our group. Well, my wife and I hadn't shared up until this point, but I led out in our group by sharing how I agreed with much of what had been shared. And then there was something a little deeper and heavier inside of me that came out, which sounded a little bit like this. It feels like our community group is shallow. And I'm sorry, because I make a judgment to be able to say that. I long to know you guys deeper. I long to know where you are needing the Lord in your life right now. I long to know where you need me and where you need us. And it can feel like, whether in our highs or lows, or when we're answering these questions, we are giving intellectual and less personal type answers, which are also fine and good, particularly contingent upon the stage at which the group is. And so newer community groups or small groups are going to be a little bit more conservative in the depth and vulnerability that they offer. And ideally, groups that have been around a longer amount of time will have a more rich and heartfelt response. Maybe not always and not every person, but that type of a response as they're engaging one another about where they are in their spiritual journey. This longing for more came out, and this statement that is kind of hard to say and maybe a little offensive. And after offering that, I wanted to invite space for folks to respond, because I knew that could be offensive, and I knew that I made judgments by saying people weren't being that vulnerable. So in sum, the group seemed to respond very well to that idea, and it seemed to resonate that they longed for more, and they longed for deeper communion with one another, even shared in the sentiment that group can feel shallow. And I think that may be part of why, and I know it's sometimes for myself, for my wife, and maybe many of you all, that we can struggle to want to show up, because it feels like this is supposed to be family, yet we don't really want to take off the mask in front of each other. We don't really want to see the messy and the ugly. And related to that, I shared that my comments may be hurtful, but I hope that we get close enough to each other as a community group that our flesh, our humanness, will actually hurt one another, not because we want to hurt one another, but because we're living that closely to each other. A layer further, I say that statement with the caveat that some weeks I'm definitely just going through with the shallow answers and the motions. But there are also definitely some weeks where I'm really vulnerable about things that I'm struggling with, or we're struggling with in our marriage, or I feel in my interpersonal narrative about inadequacy and things like that. And so the group responded really well. I actually got to have coffee with the group leader and checked in with his experience the following week. And he said he felt a bit of a sting hearing that, and wondered if what I was saying was I felt like group was a waste of my time. And I assured him it wasn't, and if it was, I wouldn't have been going. I love those people and enjoy time with them, and my soul longs for more. So I just wanted to share that experience, because I think it's so, unfortunately, relevant and maybe common in church settings. And how do we have those hard conversations? And so I just wanted to wrap up this conversation with a few takeaways, which is, one, I think it's a really good idea for community groups to have moments where they've been journeying together for some season of time, and they stop and say, let's check back in and see how we're all feeling about how community groups going. Are we growing? Are we growing in depth and in spiritual intimacy? And ultimately, the goal here being to help form one another into the image of Christ and spur one another on in that journey. And are we doing that as a group? And those check-in points are super helpful and highly encouraged. The next thought I had is, it's really important also when forming a group or at a check-in point ensuring that there's a shared vision. Like, where are we heading with this? What is the purpose of this? Why are we doing this? What do I want to get out of this? What do I expect from you as someone in my community group, as someone of the same gender in my community group? Because unclear or misaligned expectations can lead to disappointment and apathy and discouragement. And so having a candid, honest conversation up front and throughout the journey, this is what I desire. And being willing to do your part is an important step in a community group journeying together on the same direction in an edifying way. And then another takeaway is be willing to have the hard conversation. Hey, I feel like I'm sharing from my heart and I'm not being met there, or I feel missed. And it's so important when you're willing to have the hard conversation that it's out of a place of humility and knowing that you probably haven't done whatever thing you feel that the group needs more of perfectly. And so owning the fact that you don't do it perfectly, owning the fact that you're probably judgmental of others in the process, it's very likely going to be most effective to try to lead by example. I think a great idea to apologize when you realize you are being sinful or judgmental in these honest conversations. And it's important to invite authentic response. All right, here's how I feel. How does that sit with you? How do you experience me? Well, Chris, you honestly just came down really hard on all of us. And it didn't feel like love. And I'm not encouraged. I don't want to be a part of a group that is like this. Oh, gee, I'm so sorry. That's not what I meant. But you're right. I have this bitter tone about me. And then next, it's important to realize that what's vulnerable for somebody may not feel vulnerable for somebody else, and that's okay. It may feel very vulnerable for a couple to say, or someone to say, I'm really struggling in relating to my husband. Will y'all pray for me? And someone else might think that's not vulnerable at all. We all struggle in our marriages. And what are you even struggling with? But people are at different places in their journey, and not to put something onto them that they're not ready for or expect them to be somewhere where they're not. It's also important to realize that oftentimes we're not even aware of what we are wrestling with or what we're feeling or what's going on underneath. Larry had this expression, think beneath. And oftentimes we don't have those words. And so we just feel off or agitated or sad. And so when we go through sharing our high and our low, or when we go through answering a question that talks about what do you wrestle with, we may just not have the awareness or the language. I mean, we might feel ashamed to say it, and that is why we're not being authentic. And if that's you, lean in and ask the Spirit, hey, do you want me to lead out in this type of vulnerability in such a way that I won't feel violated for doing so? And then my last thought or takeaway is, however it unfolds, it's going to be messy. When there are ox in the trough, then the trough is full of dung. And that's the reality. When humans are there, a mess comes along with it. And so we all need grace and grace and grace for each other in the process of learning to be a real, authentic community. I hope this encouraged you. It's been a blessing to journey with you in this moment, and we hope to see you at the next one.